Why 95% of Australia is completely empty. Australia is the world's sixth largest country. It is so vast that it could fit two large countries like India. However, today, 95% of Australia is completely deserted. If you take a look at this map, you'll notice yellow dots. These dots mark where the people of Australia live. This means that 90% of the population is concentrated in just 0.22% of the land area. In other words, the majority of Australia's people live in only 5 major cities: Sydney, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, and Melbourne. In fact, the further you go inward from the borders of the north, south, east, and west, the chances of survival decrease significantly. Now, why does this happen in Australia? There's a fascinating reason behind it, which we will explore further. But in my opinion, it makes Australia one of the most mysterious countries in the world. The real reason why 95% of Australia is deserted has to do with a tragic event in history, one that was attempted to be hidden from us Indians and from the rest of the world. We all know that the original inhabitants of Australia were the Aboriginal people. But today, if you look around, most of Australia is inhabited by whites. So, what happened to the Aboriginals? Well, we have all heard about how the British mistreated Indians, how millions were killed, tortured, and exploited during British rule. But we were never taught about the horrors that the so-called civilized British inflicted on the Aboriginal people. They underwent mass persecution, which was one of the darkest chapters in Australian history that was, to some extent, kept from the world. To understand this better, we need to go back to the year 1606, when Australia was first discovered. Before colonization, Australia's original inhabitants, the Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders, lived in the wild. They hunted for food and gathered resources such as medicine and weapons from their land. A unique aspect of their culture was that they didn't view the land as something that could be owned or bought. They didn't believe they were the owners of the land. This is why there was no concept of land fencing in their culture. During the 17th century, Europeans were exploring the world for trade and resources. Around this time, India, Africa, and the USA were also discovered for these purposes. On January 26, 1788, the British arrived at Botany Bay, now modern-day Sydney, and discovered that the Aboriginal people didn't claim ownership of their land. They saw this as an opportunity and named the land Terra Nullius, meaning land without a master. Initially, the Aboriginals welcomed the British, but they were not alone. The British brought criminals with them: thieves, murderers, rapists, and their primary goal was to turn Australia into a penal colony. A penal colony is a place where criminals are sent to serve their sentences through forced labor. Much like the British established the cellular jail in Andaman, Kalapani, in India, between 1788 and 1868, the British sent criminals to Australia. Initially, the indigenous people were unaware of the British intention. The British lured them with promises of progress and prosperity, and, after gaining their consent, they took control of small portions of land. The British essentially wanted to establish a base, just like they did in India with the East India Company. 2 major things happened after the British arrived. First, they brought deadly diseases like bronchitis, measles, scarlet fever, chickenpox, smallpox, and whooping cough. These diseases had never existed in Australia, and the indigenous population had no immunity against them. As a result, these diseases spread rapidly. Within a year, 50% of Sydney's population was wiped out by smallpox. Similarly, 50% of the population in Port Phillip area died within a short period. But the shocking part is that the British, who had the cure for these diseases, didn't provide any help. They left the Aboriginals to die, just as they had done with Indians during the cholera, smallpox, and malaria outbreaks in India in 1900, where millions of lives were lost. The second major consequence of British colonization was that the British began to take control of more and more land, pushing the Aboriginals off their land. They started fencing off territories. Over time, the British expanded into areas like Hobart, Melbourne, and Brisbane. With these fences, they restricted the Aboriginals from hunting, using water, and gathering food from these areas. Within a few years, the British began ruling over the land and forced the Aboriginals into labor. They also subjected their women and children to sexual violence. The situation grew even worse when pregnant women were forced to work in deep waters to harvest pearls, with no regard for their well-being or that of their unborn children. The oppression escalated, and in 1795, the Aboriginals finally rebelled. This sparked a war that lasted for over 100 years. Many small battles were fought during this time, but it was a war that devastated the Aboriginal population. By the year 1900, only 30,000 to 75,000 Aboriginals were left, out of an original population of several million. This massacre of the Aboriginals was the main reason for the drastic population decline. The arrival of other European nations like the Germans, Chinese, and Japanese only added to the overall population growth, but the indigenous people were being wiped out at an alarming rate. The British did not stop there. They continued to find ways to further reduce the indigenous population. During both World War I and World War II, large numbers of Australians were sent to fight in Europe. According to Australia's war records, during World War I, the British sent men aged 18 to 44 to Europe, with many not returning. These wars had a significant impact on Australia's population, especially its male population. In addition to wars, the British introduced the White Australia Policy in 1901, also known as the Immigration Restriction Act. This law restricted non-white immigrants from entering Australia and aimed to keep the population white. This policy greatly slowed the population growth of non-white ethnicities, further maintaining a white majority population. To summarize briefly, two major things led to the population decline in Australia: the spread of diseases brought by the British, and the 100-year-long conflict with the indigenous people. Furthermore, the two world wars had a negative impact on the population, especially the male population. Lastly, the Immigration Restriction Act prevented any significant growth in non-white populations, leading to a population that is mostly composed of white Australians. Today, Australia has a population of 26 million people, but only about 3.8% are native Aboriginal Australians, which is just around 1 million people. This is even less than the average population of a town in India. So, why is 95% of Australia still empty? Aside from the historical and political reasons, there is also a geographical factor at play. Australia has extreme weather conditions that make survival difficult in many parts. The western part of the country is mostly desert, and the central lowlands contain salty, undrinkable water. Only the eastern highlands are suitable for habitation, but even there, the harsh climate makes survival challenging. Australia's weather is characterized by frequent droughts, floods, and cyclones, making it even harder to live in certain areas.